Welcome to my channel. Subscribe and enjoy my new stories every day. It started with an old suitcase, tucked into the furthest corner of the garage. The day was one of those crisp autumn Saturdays where the sun cast long shadows, perfect for sorting through the clutter we'd accumulated over years of shared life. The air smelled faintly of leaves and gasoline, and as I rummaged through forgotten trinkets and childhood toys, my hand brushed against the coarse fabric of Diane's suitcase. It was something I hadn't seen since we moved into this house 8 years ago. At first, I didn't think much of it. Diane often joked about her knack for hoarding souvenirs and oddities. My curiosity nudged me to unzip it, expecting old clothes or sentimental items. Instead, postcards spilled out, bright images of cities and sights. But as I sifted through them, confusion knitted my brow. There were places we'd never visited together, locations Diane had never mentioned. Key West, Asheville, even a magnet with the Orlando skyline, all seemingly unrelated until my mind started to piece together an unsettling pattern. I stood up slowly, the weight of realization anchoring me to the spot. A chill, colder than the crisp air, crept up my spine. I glanced at the door leading into the house, its paint chipped from years of use, as if it might whisper some hidden truth back to me. But there was only silence. That evening, Diane returned home, the gentle scrape of her keys in the lock and the familiar jingle of her bracelets like a clock counting down. She walked in, her hair still perfect from work, eyes lit with a smile that once warmed me but now looked hollow. "Hey, love," she called, tossing her purse onto the chair by the doorway. "What's for dinner?" I had spent the last few hours teetering between disbelief and anger. The silence thickened as I pretended to flip through a newspaper, barely glancing up. "Pasta," I replied, each letter heavy in my mouth. She laughed, that light, practiced sound. "Great, I'm starving." Work was nuts. Her stories of work had always been woven with familiar threads, complaints about reports, whispers of office drama, the usual. I listened, but tonight my mind replayed the words Orlando, hotel stays, and Jeremy like a broken record. "Long day?" I asked, my voice too even, too controlled. I risked a glance at her. She leaned against the kitchen counter, her gaze sliding away for a fraction of a second. It was a flicker, but it spoke volumes. "Yeah," she said, reaching for the cabinet and the comfort of her nightly glass of wine. "Just the usual." It was that moment, that lie coated in casual familiarity, that set my resolve. But instead of confronting her, I took a breath and stepped back into our routine. The script was unchanged: dinner, small talk, the warmth of routine masking the truth I was yet to voice. That night, while Diane slept beside me, breathing even and content, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The shadows there seemed alive, twisting into shapes of doubt and betrayal. My mind wouldn't stop racing through the possibilities. How deep did this go? What did it mean for Sonia, for us? Sleep was a stranger that night, slipping further from my reach with every passing minute. The following day, I acted on instinct. I scoured through emails and messages. Years of trust made it easy. I knew her passwords, her habits, the way she kept notes. I told myself I was searching for an explanation, anything that would make sense of the souvenirs, of Jeremy. But what I found only deepened the hollow ache in my chest. Emails, dozens of them, stretching back years. At first, they were professional, just two colleagues, friendly enough. But then there were references that burned in my eyes, inside jokes I couldn't understand, private details I hadn't been privy to. Orlando was a name that kept recurring, both in dates and receipts. A city she had never said she visited for work, yet it surfaced like a splinter in the fabric of her stories. My hands trembled as I flipped through the credit card records. Hotel charges matched dates that had supposedly been spent in conference halls and airport lounges. My world teetered on an edge, one wrong move from collapsing. A knock at the door interrupted my storming thoughts. It was Sonia, earbuds dangling around her neck, oblivious to the chaos stirring beneath the surface. "Hey, did you get my soccer cleats from the garage?" she asked, eyes bright with that trust only a teenager could muster. For a moment, I faltered, trapped between the facade of normalcy and the fury brewing inside. "Yeah," I managed, pointing to the bag by the door. "They're there." "Thanks, James," she said, grinning before disappearing into the world that hadn't yet shifted under her feet. I watched her go, wondering how much she knew. A question gnawed at me, threatening to dismantle the fatherly patience I had built over years. With a breath, I returned to my search, each click of the mouse a step closer to the truth I dreaded to confirm. The days after discovering Diane's betrayal were a blur. Each morning, I woke up in a house that felt unfamiliar, its walls now witnesses to a deception I couldn't ignore. Diane moved through our home with the ease of someone who believed in the strength of her own lies. She still smiled as she prepped her morning coffee, tapped out texts at the kitchen counter, and hummed softly while fixing her hair in the hallway mirror. But now, every movement felt choreographed, rehearsed to perfection. I needed more than hunches and fragmented evidence. I needed confirmation. The kind that would make any denial from her seem laughable. That's when I turned to her travel records. It wasn't difficult. Diane had always been meticulous, a trait I once admired. She kept her emails organized, itineraries neatly stored in folders marked work trips and conference details. But as I scrolled through the neatly arranged files, one glaring inconsistency made my breath catch. A supposed trip to Chicago last fall, with every detail accounted for, lacked the one thing I desperately needed: verification. The hotel she had supposedly stayed at was nowhere on our credit card statements. Instead, a high-end resort in Orlando appeared in its place. The same time frame. The lie had layers, each one peeling back with a sickening ease. That evening, I sat across from Diane at the dinner table, the silence more pronounced than usual. Sonia had gone out with friends, leaving us alone in the house that suddenly felt too large. I watched her push a piece of chicken around her plate, eyes darting to her phone every few minutes. The device might as well have been a ticking bomb, its presence so weighted that I could hear it in every pause. "What's on your mind?" she finally asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Work," I lied, sipping my drink. Her gaze searched mine, perhaps hoping for an argument to fill the emptiness between us. But I kept my expression blank. If she felt a shift, she didn't show it, just nodded and returned to her meal. That night, I waited for her to fall asleep. The soft glow of her phone screen pulsed faintly as she drifted off, and when her breathing settled into the rhythm I knew so well, I made my move. The passcode was predictable: Sonia's birthday. I scrolled, heart pounding like a drum in my chest. Recent calls, texts, emails, all sanitized, perfectly clean. But then a notification popped up, small and taunting, a new message from Jeremy. It was a simple, familiar phrase: "Can't stop thinking about last weekend." The blood rushed to my head so quickly that I had to steady myself. I copied the number and retreated, phone in hand, to the dim light of the bathroom. The silence of the house enveloped me as I dialed a number I never thought I would: a private investigator's. I spoke in low tones, my voice foreign and shaking. The man on the other end listened without judgment, asking questions in a clipped, professional manner. He suggested starting with a basic surveillance, checking work records, cross-referencing dates. It would cost a pretty penny, but at this point, I was willing to trade every cent of peace I had left. The next few days were torture. I watched Diane move through her routine, every interaction filtered through a lens of suspicion. On Tuesday, she mentioned an upcoming work trip to Denver. My stomach twisted as she outlined her plans, each word steeped in practiced nonchalance. "Networking, mostly. I'll be back Sunday evening," she said, pausing to sip her tea. I nodded, feigning interest as she described meetings that would never happen and colleagues who might as well be ghosts. I wondered how many times she had said the same words to Jeremy. On the day of her flight, I drove her to the airport, a kindness that felt like penance. She leaned over and kissed my cheek, a habit that once felt natural. Now, it was cold, a ritual that no longer meant anything. "Thanks, James," she said, eyes bright with something that might have been relief. Or was it guilt? I couldn't tell anymore. "See you Sunday." As I watched her disappear into the terminal, I felt the urge to shout after her, to demand answers, to rip away the veil of normalcy we'd been clinging to. But I kept my silence, swallowing words that would only break loose when the time was right. The first report from the private investigator came that evening. Diane hadn't checked into her Denver hotel as planned. Instead, she was booked at a boutique inn in Orlando. My hands clenched so tightly around my phone that my knuckles turned white. Sunday came, and with it, Diane's return. She walked through the front door with her suitcase and a smile that made my stomach churn. "Trip was good," she said casually, slipping off her shoes. "We should take a day off together soon." The anger simmered beneath my skin, kept at bay by sheer will. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time saw the stranger she'd become. But I stayed silent, waiting, biding my time until the moment I could confront her with the undeniable truth she'd never see coming. By the following week, the silence in our home had grown louder, pressing against the walls and seeping into every corner. Diane seemed oblivious, or perhaps she was simply accustomed to the distance that had crept between us. It felt like we were actors on a stage, performing the roles of husband and wife in a play that had lost its meaning. But I was no longer willing to continue in this farce. The moment of confrontation was closing in, as inevitable as the tide. The private investigator's report lay folded in my desk drawer. I'd read it a dozen times, each line confirming what I already knew but had refused to believe. Photos, hotel check-ins, timestamps, they painted a picture that needed no further explanation. Jeremy had been more than a ghost in her phone, he was a shadow that followed her to every city, every whispered lie disguised as a work trip. I could barely look at her during dinner, my hands tightening on the fork until my knuckles turned white. Diane filled the silence with anecdotes from work, her laughter brittle, ringing hollow in the space between us. Sonia joined us halfway through the meal, her eyes darting between us, picking up on the tension that we tried to mask. "Everything okay?" Sonia asked, her voice cautious. "Fine," Diane answered too quickly. I forced a smile and nodded, but Sonia wasn't convinced. She pushed her plate away, muttering an excuse before disappearing into her room. Diane and I sat in silence for a few moments longer, each breath stretching out the seconds. "I'm tired," she finally said, pushing back her chair. "I think I'll turn in early." She stood, pausing to touch my shoulder, a gesture that once might have been comforting. Now, it felt like an apology for something she hadn't said aloud. I nodded absently, watching her retreat to the stairs, the creak of each step an echo of the lie she lived. Once she was out of sight, I stood and walked to my office, closing the door behind me. The report stared at me from the drawer, its edges worn from my handling. I picked it up, fingers brushing over the photos of Diane with Jeremy. They were laughing in one, leaning close in another, intimacy laid bare. The bile rose in my throat, and I swallowed hard, gripping the papers as though they might anchor me. That night, as I lay in bed beside her, the weight of what was coming pressed down on my chest. She slept soundly, oblivious, the steady rise and fall of her breath almost mocking in its calm. I stared into the dark, planning every word, every moment that would follow when the truth finally shattered our fragile pretense. The next evening, I was waiting when she walked through the door, a bag of groceries in her hand, cheeks flushed from the chill outside. The living room was dimly lit, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward her like accusations. She paused, sensing the tension, her smile faltering. "James?" she asked, setting the bag down on the counter. "What's going on?" I took a breath, steadying the rage that simmered just beneath the surface. "We need to talk." The color drained from her face. She glanced at the staircase, as though measuring her escape, but something in my expression must have stopped her. She set her jaw and nodded, crossing her arms over her chest as if to shield herself from what was coming. "I know," I said, the words landing heavy in the room. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a photo, the one of her and Jeremy walking arm in arm outside the hotel. Her eyes flicked to it, widening, but she didn't speak. "Do you want to explain this?" My voice was steady, colder than I intended. Her mouth opened, closed, and then she swallowed hard. "James, I can." "Don't," I interrupted, the single word slicing through the air like a knife. "Don't try to lie to me. Not this time." The silence was deafening, stretching out as we stared at each other, the distance between us growing with each second. Finally, she lowered her eyes, the facade crumbling. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered, each word trembling. I laughed, a harsh sound that scraped my throat. "You didn't mean for it to happen?" I echoed. "You planned it. You lied, over and over again." Her eyes glistened, but there was no sympathy in me left to offer. "It was never supposed to go this far," she said, voice cracking. I was lonely, James. You were always so busy, so focused on work, and I felt invisible. And that justifies this?" I spat, holding up the photo like it was a trophy of her betrayal. "Sneaking around with him while telling me you were at conferences? Using our daughter to cover for you?" She winced, as if struck. "It's not like that." "Then what is it like, Diane? Tell me, what excuse makes this okay?" The rage I'd held back for so long finally spilled out, filling the room. She recoiled, tears streaming down her face, but I didn't relent. "I made mistakes," she admitted, voice shaking. "But it doesn't change that I still love you. This," she gestured at the photos, "this was a mistake. A horrible, horrible mistake." I stood there, the weight of her words pressing down on me, trying to gauge if there was anything left worth saving. The air between us felt thin, brittle. "I don't know if I can forgive this," I said finally, the exhaustion clear in my tone. "I don't know if I want to." Her sobs broke free then, and she sank into the chair behind her, hands covering her face. I turned away, unable to watch, my own heart twisting painfully in my chest. This was what betrayal looked like, ugly, raw, and final. The house was silent except for her cries, a haunting soundtrack to the end of what we once called home. The days that followed our confrontation were suffocating, the weight of unsaid words and shattered trust pressing down on every moment. Diane moved through the house like a shadow, eyes red-rimmed and vacant, while Sonia tiptoed around us, her silence heavy with questions she was too afraid to ask. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, had become a mausoleum of our failed promises. Diane tried to bridge the chasm, her apologies quiet, desperate, echoing in empty rooms. She asked to talk, to explain, to heal what she'd broken, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. I'd been gutted, stripped of the life I thought I knew, and all that remained was a hollow shell that mirrored the pale face of the man I saw in the mirror. One evening, Sonia finally cornered me in the kitchen, her eyes wide and scared. "Dad, are you and Mom going to be okay?" she whispered, her voice barely holding back tears. I paused, the words sticking in my throat. "I don't know, sweetheart," I said finally, forcing a small, sad smile. "But we'll figure it out. I promise." She nodded, unconvinced, and shuffled away, leaving me staring at the dinner I hadn't touched. Diane, from the doorway, watched with that same haunted expression. The pain was palpable between us, but the chasm had only grown wider. She stepped forward, tentative. "James, can we please just talk tonight?" The tremor in her voice was almost enough to crack my resolve. Almost. I nodded, unable to say no, if only for the sake of closure. We sat in the living room, separated by more than just the couch. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, the sound filling the silence between us. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," she began, eyes cast down. "But I need you to know that I regret it every single day." Jeremy meant nothing. "Stop," I said, holding up a hand. The name, spoken aloud, was like a match to dry timber. "It doesn't matter now, Diane. It's over." Her lip trembled, but she didn't cry. It was as if she'd finally run out of tears. "I know," she whispered. The admission seemed to deflate her, and for a moment, she looked so small, so defeated, that I felt a flicker of the love we'd once shared. But it wasn't enough to rebuild what she had burned down. The next morning, I found a note on the kitchen table. The paper trembled in my hands as I read it. "James. I can't keep pretending there's a way back from this. I love you, and I always will, but I see the way you look at me now, and I can't bear it. I'm going to stay at my sister's for a while, give you the space you need. Take care of Sonia, she's the best part of us. Diane." I sat down, the ache in my chest spreading like ice. She was gone. The finality of it should have felt like a relief, but it only deepened the hollow inside me. Sonia found me hours later, her expression shifting from confusion to horror as she read the note over my shoulder. "She's gone?" she asked, voice cracking. I nodded, unable to meet her eyes. She turned and ran upstairs, the thud of her door slamming echoing through the house. I followed, hesitating outside her room before pushing the door open. She was curled on her bed, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Sonia, listen," I said, stepping inside. "This isn't your fault." She didn't look at me, just whispered into her pillow, "Then why does it feel like it is?" I reached out, my heart breaking for her, for the child who'd been caught in the crossfire of our unraveling. "Because we were supposed to be better," I admitted. The truth of it hung between us, heavy and sharp. Weeks passed, and life became a series of routines, school runs, work that I barely managed, and dinners eaten in silence. Diane called occasionally, her voice hollow on the line, asking about Sonia, about me, but our conversations were short, polite. The distance grew, stretching until it felt like she was a ghost lingering in the corners of our lives. One cold November night, the call came that changed everything. I was folding laundry, the sound of the phone breaking the stillness. "James." Diane's sister, Laura, said, her voice strained and shaking. "It's Diane. There's been an accident." The room spun, her words filtering in and out like radio static. I sat down hard on the couch, the phone slipping from my fingers. Sonia's footsteps thundered down the stairs, her eyes wide with the same dread that clawed at my chest. "She's gone, Sonia," I choked out, the words like poison. "Mom's gone." The scream that ripped from her was a sound I would never forget. It shattered what little resolve I had left, splintering the thin veneer of strength I'd tried to maintain. We clung to each other, two souls adrift in a storm we hadn't seen coming. The days after Diane's funeral were a blur of numb faces and whispered condolences. People said all the things they thought might help, but their words fell into the same emptiness that Diane had left behind. I stood by her grave, Sonia's hand in mine, the cold wind biting at my face. "I'm sorry," I whispered to the silent earth. Sorry for not forgiving her, for letting her leave with only regret. Sorry for everything.